Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video you are about to see is an introduction to the book of Revelation from an Orthodox Preterist viewpoint. The title is The Apocalypse is Preterist, Revelation, the Bride, the Beast, and Babylon. All right, let's start with our presentation of the book of Revelation. The overriding assumption is that the book was predicting the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, not at the end of the world, and therefore the title is called The Apocalypse is Preterist, as opposed to the traditional futurist interpretation, which of course says that the book of Revelation is predicting the end of the world. Now, I'm going to divide the presentation up into 4 parts. I'm going to keep the overview to the left of the screen, up right there above my head. I'm not going to be able to get through but the first 2 subjects in this video, an introduction and the telltale time indicator of Revelation. I will continue this with future videos. I'll talk about the major symbols of the book and the establishment of the new covenant, which is will be taken up in later videos. So let's look at the introduction to the book of Revelation. First of all, let's look at a history of the interpretation of the book. The study of Revelation either finds a man mad or leaves him that way. John Calvin is alleged to have said, I'm not sure that historians know for sure that he said that, but he's had a reputation of running away from the book of Revelation. Allegedly, he didn't write a commentary on the book of Revelation because he couldn't understand it. And Martin Luther said, quote, I feel an aversion to it, and to me this is a sufficient reason for rejecting it. Well, should we feel an aversion to it? Should we reject it like Calvin and Luther did? Well, let's look at the first verse. Revelation 1, verse 1, the very first verse of the book says this: the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants. Now, what does the word show mean? Show means to tell you about it so that you can understand. Now, John, as we know, was exiled during Nero's persecution, and about AD 65, he wrote this book. Now, I realize the date is controversial. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, he wrote to 7 historically existing churches in Anatolia, Asia Minor, who knew nothing about black helicopters and nuclear bombs. And yet that seems to be the way the interpretation of the book of Revelation seems to go when futurists get a hold of it. But now, John wanted to show something to his servants. Show means to present something to somebody so that they understand. Even the definition of revelation, what does that mean? It means something is revealed. It's something that's showed. The name of the book of Revelation is not the book of obfuscation. It's the book of Revelation. We're supposed to understand it. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that I couldn't understand the book and nobody else could either. Didn't have the key. I'm presenting to you a radical idea that Orthodox Preterism is the key to understand this book. Now, after you finish watching these videos, I want you to give me a comment and tell me, is it what I'm saying? Is it at least rational? Is it consistent with itself? Is it likely? Is it possible? Is it probable? Well, I've gotten to the point where I'm 99.5% certain it's true. Highly, highly probable that this is the way we should interpret this book. Now, before we get started, we have to decide when John wrote the book. Now, I know that a majority of people today believe that John wrote the book in the late 1st century, about 95 AD. Now, of course, that would completely destroy the preterist interpretation of the book of Revelation, because our view is that John was writing right before the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and if he was writing it at the end of the century in 95 AD, he obviously wouldn't be talking about predicting a destruction of the temple that had already occurred more than 2 decades earlier. However, even though most scholars now take the late date view, It has not always been that way. Let me give you a quote from Kenneth Gentry, who is a well-known Orthodox Preterist scholar today. He quotes Philip Schaff, the famous church historian. Philip Schaff in 1910 was an early date advocate. He believed that John wrote the book in the 60s. He said this: the early date is now accepted by perhaps the majority of scholars. So right around 1910, the majority of scholars believed in the early date. And if you go back into the 1800s, there's no question the majority believed in the early date. So I cannot get into the technical details of why the early date is the preferred date. There's a book-length discussion of this written by Kenneth Gentry. It was his doctoral dissertation. It's called Before Jerusalem Fell. I'd urge you to read that if you would like to learn some more or study the issue in detail. But I'm just going to assume the early date as we go through this presentation. Now, next question. Are we blessed by reading it? Revelation 1 verse 3 says this: blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear. Blessed is the one who reads, blessed is the one who hears. Now let me ask you a question. How can you be blessed by a book if you can't even understand it? We are told by Jesus himself that we will be blessed by reading the book of Revelation. How many of you have been blessed by reading this book? How can we be blessed by that which we cannot understand? Now notice here that Jesus asked that the book be read aloud. Read aloud so that everybody could understand, everybody could hear. And now we don't even want to talk about it. Calvin didn't want to write a commentary about it. Revelation was given by Jesus and related by John in order to be understood. And if it's not being understood, whose fault is that? Is it John's fault? Is it Jesus' fault? Or is it our fault? Maybe we don't have the key to understanding this difficult book. Now, let's talk about hermeneutical principles in general in interpreting the Scripture. This is common knowledge. Each genre of Scripture has its own interpretive principle. For example, narrative should always be interpreted literally and not spiritualized or made metaphorical. On the other hand, apocalyptic literature should be interpreted metaphorically. I will submit to you that futurists do it exactly backwards. They have it exactly wrong when they go to the book of Revelation. Now, for example, Revelation 1 verse 1 says this: the things that must soon take place. Jesus tells John, I want you to tell everybody about the things that must soon take place. Now, that's narrative. That's not apocalyptic imagery. It's just Jesus talking to John, and he says a word that you would think people would take literally. Soon. I mean, soon. Where's the symbolism in that? Soon. It means soon. And yet futurists will say, no, it means 2,000 plus years in the future. Whereas preterists take it literally and say, no, it means in a few years when the temple was destroyed in AD 70. Let me give you another good example of this. Revelation 8:10. Here, John says this: a great star fell on the rivers. A third of the waters became wormwood. Now, literalist, futurist, mainly dispensationalist, would have us believe that we should take the Scripture literally, the prophecy literally. Well, if a star literally fell on the rivers of the earth would have been burnt up long before the star even got to the earth. In fact, the whole entire planet would have been burnt up and destroyed. And yet, the Scripture says that only a third of the waters were burnt up. Well, if you want it literal, how can a third of the waters be literally destroyed? Only a third of the waters literally be destroyed, and 2/3 of the waters be saved, and literally have a star landing on the earth. Well, you can't. That's illogical. Well, here's how the futurists try to get around it. They try to say, oh, well, star doesn't mean that. It means meteor. Look up in a commentary. The Greek word, I think it's aster, the Greek word for star has one definition in all the concordances. The one definition is star. Meteor is nowhere to be found. But the dispensationalists will spiritualize this verse, and they'll make a metaphor of it, and they'll stretch the literal meaning to get out of the boxes that their erroneous interpretation gives them when they try to interpret the book. So, is star literally a star? If it is, you cannot take that apocalyptic passage in Revelation 8:10 literally. You have to take it apocalyptically, metaphorically, because that's the way apocalyptic literature is meant to be. There's no more metaphorical book in the Bible than the book of Revelation. Now, let's look at the scope of this presentation. Now, Revelation is a long and difficult book. So to narrow down the presentation, I'm going to not discuss the 7 historical churches, and I'm not going to discuss the millennium in chapter 20. That's worthy of 2 or 3 videos in itself. It's a great issue. I like talking about the millennium, but we're not going to do it here. The bulk of the discussion will be about 13 major symbols in the book of Revelation. Not in this video, but in the next one. Now, as I said earlier, I assume that John wrote the book in the mid-60s. I'm also going to make another major assumption that John was speaking of AD 70. That's the Orthodox Preterist assumption. Revelation, in fact, according to my view, is John's version of the Olivet Discourse. Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not have a version of the Olivet Discourse. John, the Gospel of John, does not. And the reason probably is because he had his version in the book of Revelation. All right, now, when John is speaking of the end here, he's speaking of the end of the old rabbinic apostate Israel. He's not talking about the end of the world. He also has 3 major themes in the book which point to AD 70, and I'm going to talk about these 3 major themes right now. The first major theme is that the old Jerusalem is destroyed and the new Jerusalem is established. In other words, he goes from the old Jerusalem to the new Jerusalem. So most of the first part of the book is about the destruction of the old Jerusalem. The last part of the book, which we will not talk about in this video, but in a later video, the last part of the book of Revelation is about the culmination of the new Jerusalem. The new Jerusalem, in my humble opinion, goes from the first advent to the second advent, and John is talking about the glorious end of the new covenant as the new covenant Christians enter into the final state. So the book of Revelation is not entirely preterist. We get to the last couple of chapters, we're talking about the projection of the good news about the new covenant, the church that we're in now. All right, so but anyway, the first major theme is that the old Jerusalem is destroyed, the new Jerusalem is established. The second theme is that there were 2 persecutors of the church. Historically, you know who those were. You have the Romans and the Jews. So when we go through the book, we will interpret the symbols as symbolic of persecution by the Romans and the Jews. And when I say Jews, of course, I don't mean all Jews in all times. You know, let me make a point here. Oftentimes people say that preterists are anti-Semitic because we're opposed to the Jews. No, we're opposed to that wicked generation that Jesus himself denounced 7 times in Matthew 23, and which he denounced all through the Gospels. Nobody calls Jesus anti-Semitic. He was Jewish himself. His disciples were Jewish. He was just complaining about that generation of Jews who murdered him. And that's all we're complaining about. We're not saying that all Jews from all time are guilty of murdering Jesus. Of course not. But you will be amazed at how many times dispensationalists will hurl that pejorative charge at people like yours truly. All right, so the 2 persecutors of the church, Jerusalem, the old Jerusalem, the apostate Jews is one persecutor, and the Roman Empire is the other. The third major theme of Revelation is that believers will be delivered from this persecution so that the gospel may be preached all over the world and that the new covenant will be established. Revelation is ultimately a book of encouragement and victory. All right, the second part of this presentation is going to be dealing with the telltale time indicators in Revelation. Now, in the Olivet Discourse, there was a telltale time indicator that said this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, all these apocalyptic, eschatological things take place. Well, in the book of Revelation, the telltale time indicators are just as clear, and in fact, you could argue even clearer, but they are completely ignored by futurist commentators. So let's look at the telltale time indicators, our second part of this PowerPoint presentation. There are 7 verses in Revelation that give us an indication of when this book, or when the events in the book were going to take place. The first indicator is the Greek word takos, which means soon. There are 7 verses that contain that that word. Let me read them real quickly for effect. Revelation 1:1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. Revelation 2:16, I will come to you soon, Jesus says. Revelation 3:11, I am coming soon, Jesus says. Revelation 22:6, the Lord has sent his angel to show his servants which must soon take place. Revelation 22:7, I am coming soon. Revelation 22:12, I am coming soon. Revelation 22:20, I am coming soon. Now, all you literalist, futurist dispensationalists who might be listening to this, you probably won't be, but what part of soon do you not understand? You want to take the book literally? Well, literally, look at those words and tell me what soon means, what takos means. It means soon, AD 70. Now, there are other time indicators, but before we get to the next one, I want to emphasize this point about soon again, takos. From the first verse to the next to the last verse of Revelation, we have that phrase, that word, scattered through the book. The very first verse says that Jesus must show his servants the things. Jesus is going to show his servants the things which must soon take place. First verse. Next to the last verse, Revelation 22:20, I am coming soon. It's there, clear, for anybody who has not been brainwashed, who does not have his blinders on, who does not have his rose-colored glasses on. It is clear that John was not talking about the end of the world. Now, excuse me for being so emphatic, but this I know is a radical concept. The first time I heard it, I almost choked. I had a hard time believing it until I started looking at it. I said, well, I never noticed that before. Of course I didn't notice it because I was brainwashed. Now let's look at the next time indicator. 2 verses containing engus, which means near in the Greek. Revelation 1:3, the time is near. Is 2,000 plus years near, or is 80-70 near? Revelation 22:10, first chapter to the last chapter. Revelation 22:10, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. Let me ask you an impertinent question. What part of near do we not understand? The time is near from the first chapter to the last. It's near. It's not 2,000 years in the future. All right. We're not going any further here. I'm going to stop it right here. If you enjoyed this video, perhaps you would like to see some others along the same lines, you can subscribe to my channel in the links below, in the screen below. And next video we'll talk about major symbols of the book of Revelation and the establishment of the new covenant.